This is Duke University.
Thanks, everyone, for coming here today. I'm Ranji Khanna, and I'm the new director of the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I've also inherited this very nice role of being the second PI on the project that Maria mentioned, the Versatile Humanists, which I keep muddling in my head and calling it the Virtual Humanists. Virtual. But actually, yes, versatile. Maybe we should come together.
Can I just first of all ask Chrissy, you go by,
yes,
right? Chrissy
I do.
Cortina, to introduce yourself as you are our guest from outside Duke. So welcome.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me for a whole range of reasons, not the least of which is I live right down the road. So I continue to live here in Durham, and I commute up to DC. After this panel, I'll have dinner with my family, and then I'll drive home, or drive up to my home up there, not home, as we say in our family. So I am a historian. Primarily, my research fields are 20th century race and gender history. I got my PhD at Brown. I got my undergraduate degree at NC State. So for me, I actually had to look up where Brown was and where Rhode Island was before I accepted my position there. And so I then returned. And so I've been at the endowment for a little over 5 years. Previous to that, I was contract faculty at NC State University, where I graduated, which was a unique honor, and also Guilford College in Greensboro. So at the NEH, and I think one thing to know is that when I first began working for the NEH, I realized how relatively little I didn't know coming out of a fairly traditional academic background, which was that the NEH is really about more than just research fellowships and teacher institutes. And I feel like if you come from, again, an academic university or college, oftentimes that's our primary sort of connection to NEH. And I would say, and I'll leave off, I know this is supposed to be an introduction, but I gave you 2 handouts, and one of them, Grant Program Contacts, is because I work for the Division of Public Programs, and we have our own set of grants, and every division at the NEH operates a little bit slightly differently in our grants and how we kind of structure them. So not being completely up to date on everything, I've got this handy cheat sheet. So that's also for you all after today, if you're interested in a particular grant. I certainly strongly encourage you to contact a program officer. So I'm a senior program officer. The delightful thing for me in the Division of Public Programs is you get to work with a whole group of very smart, engaged people. My fellow program officers include a philosopher, a former documentary filmmaker, and public librarian. Let's see, people, someone who's written a new biography of Eddie Cantor, who comes out of a traditional kind of American studies background. And so we bring together, I think, a lot of specialties. And I think one of the things that people are kind of hesitant to know about the NEH, because, we have a fairly imposing, footprint, I think, online. And they're telling us they're redesigning our website, which is great. But you can call or email any of us. And we're usually just delighted to talk about individual projects, to sort of even hash out ideas about projects. People do that with me when I'm in the office. Sometimes I will direct them to other grant lines. Sometimes I'll help them think about sort of honing a project to sort of fit one of our current grants. So that's all. That's all I'll say.
Thanks very much. That's
You're
a very
welcome.
nice introduction to open it up to saying, call me.
Yes, yeah.
For more. Yes, very nice.
Hi, I'm Phil Ruprecht. I'm in my third year as chair of the music department. My own research is on 20th century British music, mid and later 20th century, although I'm gradually moving back in history, so I'm back to the 1920s at the moment, which feels very distant for me. But and I think maybe because music sometimes has a reputation as a rather, intricate, specialized discourse. I think trying to write grants and convince people that, your ideas about music are important, you have to speak to a broad audience, and you can't get very technical. So that's both a difficulty and something you have to think about writing grants. I suppose I'm here today because I've had 2 NEH grants. One was a fairly modest amount of money, but it was very helpful for a collaborative grant with a colleague at UNC for a conference in 2010. And that was my first encounter with the NEH, and it was a very happy one. And we brought in scholars from Europe, and we had American scholars, and we had a great conference. And then I was invited to serve on the musicology panel and went up to DC for a day-long the review process that year. And I think we had about 100 applications, if I remember. And then I applied myself a couple of years later and had a sabbatical fellowship. And I did finish the book. And it was published in 2015, and I sent it to the NEH. So I've applied twice, and I've seen something of the process. And anyway, that's enough.
Good afternoon. I'm Maria LaMonica Wisdom, and my current role is Director of Graduate Student Advising and Engagement for the Humanities at Duke Graduate School, and I'm also working closely with the Vice Provost's Office Interdisciplinary Studies. And there may not be an obvious connection with the NEH just from that information, but my current role is partially funded by Duke's a relatively new next-gen PhD implementation grant. So I'm overseeing, along with Ed Balzan and Ranji, a project called Versatile Humanists at Duke. And our goal is to think very broadly about how do we continue to strengthen and enhance doctoral training in the humanities here at Duke. So that's my current work. I've actually had 2 different careers at this point. One as a faculty member and now full-time as a higher ed administrator. And probably maybe one of the most consistent threads is ongoing involvement with the NEH in different ways. And so just so you know what I've done. So actually my PhD is in Victorian literature from Indiana. So that was career number 1. And I was an associate professor of English at a small college in South Carolina for 11 years. And just one thing to mention is I somehow did manage to get a book published while I was there, most semesters teaching a 4-4 load, and I would not have been able to do it without the NEH. So I had a summer seminar fellowship over in England, and that's where I had wonderful colleagues holding my hands and teaching me how to do archival research. And it wasn't just the resources, but just the self-confidence that gave me and the affirmation. And so then 2 years later, I went back and I said, I want more money. And so I got a NEH summer stipend for the same book project. And it got published in 2008. Oh, it's 10 years old already. And it was a book on Protestant Catholic controversy and Victorian women's writing. And then I transitioned about 6 years ago. I became a full-time administrator. I was at UNC Chapel Hill as executive director of their Humanities Institute. So there I was a lead writer on an NEH challenge grant our institute went up for. We actually didn't get it, but we learned a lot in the process, and I could talk about that. And then also I have been a reviewer twice for NEH. In 2010, I was a reviewer for the year-long fellowships, 4 monographs. And then very recently, I was a reviewer for the NEH Next Gen PhD Planning Grants, which is a smaller version of the grant that Duke has.
Maybe what we could do is ask Chrissy to start us off, because I think that, a question on everyone's mind over the last year or so has been what the state of the National Endowment for the Humanities is, and how you understand its immediate future.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I would say first that I am always heartened by the fact that NEH is, I guess, currently almost 53 years old as an agency. So we came out of the Great Society kind of legislation, and we're kind of our sister organization created by the same act of Congress is the NEA. So I always lead with that because I think there have been various times, and I've been at the endowment a little over 5 years, as I mentioned. When I first got in, there were a lot of people who were there almost from the beginning, from the 70s and mid-80s, who would sort of sit around and sort of say, oh, this is nothing. Like they tried, and they would regale us, all of us new folks, with stories of, various times in which NEA as an agency was embattled. I say that really as a way of saying that is one of the things that makes us different, I think, from other funding agencies is it is a fact of life that we are intricately linked to the political situation for, good or ill. But I always say, again, 53 years and we're still here. That said, a week ago, I guess last Monday, the White House presented what really is the first, as someone who is never, this is my first federal job, I had to sort of figure this out. These federal budgets are kind of negotiation between the White House and Congress. And so the initial volley or sort of opening is the White House's budget. And so they presented a budget to Congress for the fiscal year beginning 2019, and that called for a zeroing out of the NEH and the NEA budget. Again, we've been in this situation before, probably about a year ago, and yet we still gave out, I don't know how many millions of dollars of grants last year. So I don't have a crystal ball. I was noticing it says, and the future. And gosh, I guess the simple answer is we don't have an inside track, and folks do call us. And I think legitimately, and again, if you're interested in a particular grant or grant line, I think it's worth communicating with the program officer. We get this question all the time. So because I work in public programs, I work with documentary filmmakers, with museum and library folks, and it takes a very large institutional commitment to put together an NEH grant. I know I don't need to tell you all about this. And the hidden question is, so should I go to all this trouble to do this? The short answer is you have to make up your mind for yourself. But the longer, I think, response is that we don't know what the future will hold. I think the good thing about our grants is that you do learn a lot. You synthesize, you shape your project for kind of a broad audience in a lot of cases, and you sort of hammer out those themes and your teams in a way that I think is helpful to any project and any grant. So beyond that, for right now, all of our grants are continuing. We are allowed to continue to do business up through, I suppose, 2019. But any grants right now in public programs, we have our next deadline is June for we have a digital projects for the public grant line. And then there's another deadline in August for our media projects and also our what we call now public humanities projects, which are museums, libraries, things like that. So once grants are made, and we were speaking about this a little bit, Maria and I, once a grant is made, it is a contract. So no matter what happens, if you're awarded a grant, that is a commitment, a financial commitment that the endowment is bound to honor. So
Thank you.
that's sort of
No, that's very helpful. And if there are things that I think that many of us know that we can call people up and express our support to the National Endowment of Humanities, and also certainly the Consortium of Humanities Centres and Institutes, which we are a part, has also given input in this regard. But I hope that we will keep the channels open, and you'll tell us if there's anything obvious we can do to help you. So let's move on to some questions that most people are here to hear, and that is really, we would like to understand what the best way is of crafting a proposal, and with that in mind, sort of thinking about the kind of evaluation criteria that you use. And if I suppose Phil and Chrissy, we'd love to hear from you on this one in particular.
Well, I was thinking this question will come up with the idea that there's some secret, and there's that David Mamet play about the real estate people, and it boils down to ABC. Always be closing. I was thinking I could just come up with some kind of formula like that. But I couldn't think. It didn't fit with music or ABC. I couldn't quite get it. So I wrote ABC here, but. And then I have some things that didn't fit. So I've got sort of 3 headings that seem important to me, and I'll just quickly go through them and then sort of kind of don't forget. So, the first heading is and I think this is the most important and we can come back to it, but the process of doing the grant. I think the end product of this grant, no matter how many years you've been working on it or how interdisciplinary or digital or whatever it is, the end product is a three-page narrative and some supporting CV and bibliography and a couple of letters, And so, keep this real. You send that in. You're one of 100 applications, and what happens next is someone has to read 100 applications. Actually, several people read it, and so just remember that you are writing for someone who's going through 100 applications. So, what that boils down to is write well. It really, you might think, well, there's my project speaks for itself. I don't have to make this, but no, the project that is absolutely lucidly presented, that is well written, will jump out of the pile. I really firmly believe that. So I think that's the most important thing I could say. So how do you do that? Well, I think the first part of that is, this is my heading A, is the process. You have to plan ahead, and everyone has their own writing process. But for me, it's a kind of gradual draft evolves and polishing, and you can't do it overnight. Some people work well under pressure, but I wouldn't leave this till the last minute. I would show a draft to colleagues. I would consider how you're going to use the 3 or 4 pages or whatever it is. Sometimes I'll say 2,000 words, sometimes I'll say 3 pages. Just be really intentional about how you use that space. And if they say 3 pages, fill the 3 pages. You do not write 1.5 pages. That will not look like a serious grant. I guess I could say more about that, but I'll move on. Heading B for me was what are the ingredients of the narrative, and I think some of these are probably self-evident, but you've got to clearly define the value and the scope and the methodology of the project. If people are sort of wondering, what is this? This sounds very interesting, but I don't quite know what it is. Is it a book? Is it a movie? Is it a database? If they're asking that question, you've lost them. They have to know, and it mustn't be hard for them to figure that out. They need to know by the end of the first paragraph what they're dealing with. You are writing for, I think I'd be interested to hear Chrissy's take on this, but I think particularly with the NEH, you have to make sure you're writing for the educated layman, not the specialist. And that's probably true for nearly all the grants we write. You just can't fall back on your comfortable disciplinary jargon. You know, you start quoting Althusser or Derrida, or, you know, I mean, these are great theorists, don't get me wrong, but, or if I start quoting Schenker, no one will know who Schenker is. And, you know, he's like a god in my field, but no one cares. It's you know, the person on the 5th floor of the NEH has to understand every word in your paragraph, otherwise you're not going to get the grant. The other thing in the ingredients is I would clearly explain what you've already done and what you plan to do during the grant. Mm-hmm. And be realistic about that. Don't say you're going to write 2 books in 1 year. You know. And then the heading C is the format. So I would think very carefully about how you organize, not just the essay itself or the narrative. I like to have subheadings. I think, you know, intertitles, kind of like in a silent movie, you know, they sort of communicate very fast to a reader, even before they go into the section. But also how you organize your CV. If they only give you 2 pages, you have to come up with a very snappy format CV. How you organize the bibliography, usually you've only got 1 page. You know, what are you trying to communicate with that? That's integral to, don't do that at the last minute. That's part of it. That can show the scope of the project. So that's my A, B, C. A is the process, plan ahead, write really well. B is the ingredients of it. We just talked about that. The format is C. And the don't forgets. There's 2 practicalities. The first one is it's worth taking the time. So even though you may not get the grant, and it may take you, the first NEH grant I applied for, it took me 30 hours work. And I just decided this month, that's about all the time I have, other than teaching at Duke and advising and committees. But I could spend 30 hours this month and, you know, I won't be able to write any work on this book or this essay besides applying for this grant. But let's see. And, but what I want to remind you is if you were writing 3 pages and you're asking for a year off, each word is worth $50. Okay? Do the math. You know, it's like 300 words a page, $15,000 a page. You know, so it's worth taking the time. You know, this is very, you know, it's really cost-benefit analysis. It's worth taking the time. And that's a practicality. And the other thing is, what is it? I can't read my own writing here. Yeah.
Did you say right clearly? Right.
Yeah. Type everything out. Yeah. I think it comes back to, you know, how much time it takes. You know, and what I've written here is, it's because I've abbreviated it. Give yourself permission to take that time. You know, it's like, don't think, well, I don't have time to work on this properly, so I'll just do this, you know, on Sunday evenings after I've been writing my, you know. Decide how much time it's going to take for you to come up with a finished product and take that time. Because the effort you expend is absolutely transferable to any other grant application. And the narrative you create, I mean, that's the intellectual work. In my case, I was applying for conferences and books. Some of the phrases I came up for these grants ended up in the book. Some of them ended up on the back cover of the book. You suddenly realize, oh, this is what I'm doing. Now, this is the hook for this book. You know, I mean, you've been thinking about it for years, but how can you explain that to, you know, your aunt? You know, this is what I'm doing, you know, someone who's not in your field. And if so, the act of writing the grant for some sort of invisible, all-powerful audience up there in DC who's going to give you the money or not, and be able to crystallize that very clearly, that's just so valuable for chapter 1 and the intro and the preface and the half-title narrative. And, you know, the publisher wants, like, what is this book about? 150 words. You know? So it's absolutely not wasted time at all.
I think that's really helpful. Can I just have one follow-up question to that as well? Because I think that this idea of crystallizing the project, and this is language that you will then be able to use in multiple different spaces, is very nice. Sometimes it feels, and this isn't I'm not saying this in relation to the NEH, sometimes it feels when you're writing a grant proposal that actually you have to sort of take out anything humanistic from the language of it, and that it's in a language that is anathema to humanistic thinking. But what you seem to be saying is that that's not the case here. That you are writing for humanists, right? Even if these humanists are not necessarily the ones who are going to be working on chapter 4 of grammatology or whatever, and don't really want to have that language in okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
the panelists in DC are going to be in your field, broadly
Right,
speaking. I mean, the
right.
panel I was on was called musicology, and there's another panel called ethnomusicology, and there may be another panel that has more to do with performance. I'm not sure, but they're very smart people. You know, they're in your field. But they may not know anything about. I mean, I was writing a book about British music. They may not have even heard of any British composers. That doesn't matter. But they are fellow musicologists. But yes, if you start talking about difference and chapter 4 of grammatology, it will be potentially alienating. Even, I think, if you were a literary scholar, you know, for this kind of grant.
Absolutely.
I mean, we all use those kind of meta languages, and there are certain, you know, I mean, there are fashions that come and go in all of our fields, but I think, remember again, there's 100 applications. Maybe 75 of them are going to have that jargon in. So you're not going to stand out from the crowd if you say something smart about Derrida, because all your colleagues are doing that as well. So, you know, I'm not trying to be anti-intellectual at all. You have to find a way of explaining, you know, a Derridian idea without his terminology and without using an italicized French term. And that's really hard. But if you can do that, then you are really communicating.
I could just add to that. Everything you say resonates with me completely. You know, and I'm thinking particularly of my experience as a reviewer with the book length, or the year-length book fellowships. And I remember with that particular situation, I think it may be helpful too to think about like who's in the room and how would this work. I found the dynamic with the rest of the selection committee interesting, and maybe it was just this one committee, but just be aware that the selection committee, they're selected by somebody else, and you know, and maybe there's somebody, if it's your field, or maybe a person or two you already know, maybe you've met at a conference, but there may be people you've never met before, and it's an interesting situation where you're suddenly being thrown together and say, you all work together, make important decisions, and I think that's hard to work that way. And so you all don't know where you're coming from necessarily. And I remember there being some ferocious disagreements about things. And if I think just broadly about like how things fell, I remember there being like about maybe half a dozen that just leapt to the top, and everybody, despite our differences, could agree that they were amazing. And then there was a little like maybe another 6 down at the bottom. Everyone was like, "Boo, no!" And then there was so much in the middle, and people were very divided. And I thought, we're all smart people. We're all competent. Why are we so divided on this? And I'm still wondering that sometimes. But I think one way to explain it is they were the ones in the middle were brilliant ideas that weren't maybe very well articulated. So some people got it. Other people didn't, but they weren't written well enough so that everybody got it. Right. So that's just my sense.
Oh, Victoria. No, Victoria, do you want to just introduce yourself? That's what everyone did here. And so,
okay. Yeah. Hi, I'm Victoria Szabo. I'm clearly overcommitted, so I deeply apologize for getting here so late today. So I am the director of the Digital Humanities Initiative here at the FHI, as well as the co-director of the PhD lab. And right now I have an NEH Institute, Summer Institute grant for virtual and augmented reality for the Digital Humanities, which will be taking place this summer and next summer. What else do you want to know at this point?
I think that this is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to I think what both of you all said and shared in terms of your experience as reviewers is really helpful and wonderful. And you do us proud. We do our best to select reviewers who we think can come in with some sense of both knowledge of the field or, their specific discipline, but also bring, a little depth. The one thing that I would say is, so we do have a panel review process, But that's really the first stage. So you said make decisions.
Oh, sorry,
and
you're
so,
right.
No, I mean I have to sort of say that. Yeah,
Right.
it is it's a long process in terms of when we have a grant deadline, we will divide our applications up into types of projects. Then as a program officer, I go out and try and find the very best people to review those. In public programs, a little different from research, although I know they have similar and digital. Each of our grant lines has slightly different criteria for reviewers, but in our case, that means what we call, three scholars. So people who are familiar with, maybe I have a panel of 15 applications, and some of them some of them are library programs, some of them are, museum exhibits. We try and sort of make sure that it makes sense that they would be together, reviewed together. They're not going to be reviewed against each other. We're very clear with our reviewers about that, but we have 3 subject scholars, and then we'll have 2 what we call practitioners. So if it's a panel of museum exhibitions, then it's people who actually work in museums. If it's a digital project for the public, we've had game designers, we've had people who head up and have made their own games, humanities-based games. So that's kind of the core. Our reviews are done online, so we actually ask, as a reviewer, I'm surprised you didn't say this, we ask you to write a lot about the applications. We ask you to actually write comments because, and this is the other thing that no one has mentioned, you as an applicant can request those comments. In our division, because we have relatively few, and in research is the largest, my understanding is they don't automatically send those back to applicants. In our division, we do, because we sort of have the luxury. But you can always request to see the comments. What will happen is you will receive those written comments. They will have any identifying it's an anonymous review process, so we ask our reviewers to not self-identify them. Call me up if you want an expert in whatever, It's usually not that blatant, but we ask that it's, a relatively anonymous position, and you can always resubmit. And a lot of people I know have found that incredibly helpful. Reading those comments, again, even if you don't choose to resubmit to our agency, you could certainly take those comments because they're from a group of really, thoughtful, knowledgeable people with you. So that's sort of my kind of pitch. And we make recommendations. So again, there are no decisions made at the time of the panel. We make recommendations. Ultimately, we have, and this is all online, the NEH has a National Humanities Council, 26 men and women from across the country, some from here at Duke, who are presidential appointees and serve staggered terms. And ultimately, we as an agency, they come to DC 3 times a year. We make official recommendations. We meet in small committees. They discuss those, and that's how the ultimate decisions get made. So it's not really just 1 or 2 people that you can sort of pin a decision on.
That's really helpful. Sorry.
Would it be helpful for me to talk about the digital humanities process? Have you already done that?
No, we haven't. So
yeah, so the digital humanities process is similar, except for it's an in-person process. And so I've been on a number of panels where we would gather together, but otherwise it's very much the same as what you're describing, that experts in the field, but in the sub areas that are relevant, come together and converse about the different projects. And I think what's important to note there is that there's an interest in both the intellectual questions being asked and in the digital movement forward. And there's an expectation that there will be forward movement on both fronts, so that you're simultaneously answering an intellectual question and finding a way to move forward the larger conversation around the technology. If you're doing a plain digitization type of thing, there's different programs for that. But if you want to do something that that is going to be under the umbrella of the Office of the Digital Humanities, what you're trying to do is move the discourse around the technology and its uses and its affordances for academic work forward. And then within that, the individual peers are, that when I've gone, it's people I've heard of. They're like the people that you know of in the field, and it becomes this really rich kind of conversation that is, of course, contained just within that room, but you end up getting a much larger sense of what's going on in the discipline as a whole. So I think that a thing to know is that you're not going to be able to BS your way through a proposal or assume that people aren't going to be able to see through your lack of a data plan or the fact that you don't have any kind of prototype or something like that. You really have to have done your homework and to be able to, as much as possible, illustrate and demonstrate how you've thought through some of the questions. So simply saying, I want to do a website about X isn't enough. You'd have to explain why it's a website. What's your information architecture going to be? What business, what purpose is it going to serve that a print text couldn't serve? Or, how is it going to help us to understand how we can use metadata differently in order to understand reading in a distant form, or something like that. There really has to be some depth there.
Well, and I would say this is you gave me my inroad to talk about digital humanities. So the other handout that Joseph very graciously photocopied and distributed is my colleague, whom you might know in the Office of Digital Humanities at NEH, Jen Cerventi, came up with this really lovely overview of the grants for digital humanities. And I would say, so here again, each grant is slightly different. What you spoke about, Victoria, are the grants in the Office of Digital Humanities. In, for example, my division, we have a fairly new grant line, Public Humanities Digital Projects for the Public, DPP. Washington loves their acronyms. This is what I've learned. So there, we actually emphasize that you don't have to be making an inroad in the field. And that is a big difference, because sometimes people will sort of assume that they have to do that. So the first thing I would say is read the grant guidelines, because that's very important, because they can be very different. I would say for us in digital projects for the public, we actually want you to explain how you're going to find an audience, how you're going to reach them. That's less, that's less of an issue. You can be speaking to sort of other digital humanists with some of the ODH grants, with some of the preservation and access grants as well. For us, we really want to have an end audience and a sort of plan for engaging them as an endpoint. So again, the different grants are, digital grants across the agency are here.
So with that question of...
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
I did have a question. When you mentioned the review process, and we're talking about making the recommendations through to the Humanities Council, National Humanities Council, should applicants be concerned about the politics of their projects? I've worked with a few people recently who are doing work on the history of Islam and the influence thereof. And what should scholars be thinking about when it comes, time for recommending to a politically charged body?
I think that, again, I'm encouraged by the fact that the NEH and folks involved with the NEH who run the NEH are humanists. We believe in the value of the humanities in American public life. I mean, I think that sometimes it can be easy to sort of say, oh, the NEH doesn't want to do a topic on climate change, or, that's it, don't even bother. I would not say that. However, here comes the however piece. We do have fairly strict guidelines. We cannot financially support or fund a project that advocates for a particular line of thinking. So, and this, you know, it's a delicate balance. I mean, so I often will say that we're in the business of educating people. You know, we want, and we have funded projects. I think it came out about 2 years ago at University of Miami. We had a grant line that was sort of special for our 50th anniversary called Humanities in the Public Square, and we specifically asked for topics that were relevant to people at, you know, American life. And one of the projects that we ended up funding was on climate change. But the difference was, and I think what made that fundable and sort of answers your broader question is, so it was educating people about, you know, what's the history of this? What's sort of the future of this? What's some, and here I don't know all of their, can't remember all of their programs. What's the literature around, you know, climate change, around, you know, sort of all of that? It did not say, and, you know, we cannot support a project where people say, well, get out and vote on X thing next, you know, next November. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's a fine line. I always think that really approach it from the standpoint of educating people, you know, rather than directly encouraging them to a particular action, I think, is the difference.
I suppose I want to ask sort of some nitty-gritty questions about the proposals, and one of them would be about how reviewers go about assessing things like timeline, right? I think that, you know, this is often a difficulty that we have projecting forward, right? You know, is it that you have to say, okay, in the first year or in the first 2 months, I'm going to be doing X and Y, and the next 3, it's going to be this, and then it's all going to be done by month 8, and or whatever. Or how do you think about timelines and crafting or assessing these proposals?
I was looking at you because I thought you had a great, you know, you said be realistic, which I think is really helpful. Yeah.
I mean, to pick up on what Maria said a few minutes ago, the experience on the musicology panel, it was a carbon copy of what you just described. There were 6 or 7 sort of superstar projects that everyone was in love with. There was this sort of, you know, group at the bottom that we didn't discuss at all, and then there were many in the middle that there was an absolute range of opinion on, and we spent the whole day talking about them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, you know, knowing that maybe 7 or 10 would be going forward to the next level of recommendation, you know, and out of the 100. So totally, I didn't get the sense that there was a kind of timeline, there was a flexibility. You know, some people, I mean, in musicology, most of the projects, people are asking for a year to finish a monograph. So some of the people asking are near the beginning of the monograph, or to write on a monograph for a year. And, you know, so if you're writing an 800-page history of Russian music, you're not going to get that done in 1 year. Or, you know, so maybe you're going to get the grant earlier in the book. And, or maybe you've written 4 chapters and you've got 3 drafted. And this was my situation last time I got the grant. And I said, these are finished and done. These are drafted and will be revised during the year. I mean, and I didn't sugarcoat it. You know, it was a big book, and I can finish this. And I did, and I knew I could. But I do remember, you know, I won't tell you the name of the person, of course, but I remember that one of the applications we had a good laugh about, because it was someone who had written several books, and this author said somewhere in the application, I can draft 7,000 words a day. You know, and it was like this sort of macho kind of, you know, I'm going to write this book, soup to nuts, you know, in 8 months, and I'll have it on your desk. And we all thought, well, you know, we knew the author by reputation, this person had a list of books, and that was probably a true statement about that author's process, but it didn't really matter to anyone in the room because it was kind of laughable anyway, because most people think, well, I'm lucky if I get 70 words a day that I can actually publish. So everyone was like, okay, well,
the next day.
Good. And also there's a sense that kind of boast had nothing to do with the quality of the project. So, I mean, the shorter answer is the timeline varied immensely. I think it was kind of lower down the priorities than the gist of the intellectual worth and the educational value of it, on the probity of the scholarship, the preparation for the project. Certainly, an end goal is the NEH, I think, wants to fund books that actually get written. And there's great emphasis on when you have finished it, upload it, send us a copy, tell us about it, because our stats depend on this. So,
but in that regard,
you're also looking at the CV. So if you look at someone who's had 3 NEH grants and they've never published a book, that's, to me, a red flag. It's like, well, this is someone who doesn't finish the book.
Well, along with the timeline, too, I'd add, I think what we found compelling, too, is not just, it's one thing if you've done all your research and you just need to write, okay, well, here's how I'm going to, but, especially if you're in the earlier stages and you're still researching, I think the more details you can give into, okay, I'm going to do this task first, and I'm going to do this task, I'm going to consult this archive and this archive, or, I'm going to get, this piece is getting published through this journal, or just to show them all the pieces that are involved, I think helps it seem more real to them. And so, I don't have a magic answer for the timeline. They're all going to look different. But I think the more real you can, paint a real picture where they can see you doing the work, and they're going to feel a lot better funding you.
Right. Well, and I think for digital projects, there is more maybe of an expectation that there's a specific product at the end.
Right.
And so what you really have to do is work back from the end point that you have, and then recalibrate once you realize that you're way too ambitious. As you're producing the timeline, the act of producing the timeline helps you to create a more realistic sense of what you're going to be able to accomplish. Because I know we threw out projects that seemed great, but we didn't believe it. So similar to what you're describing, of course, we would love you to be able to, figure out how to link all the libriaries of the world. But this is just not, it's just not going to happen like that. But maybe you can link this one thing with that one thing. So so specific, I'm going to say it, specific, measurable, achievable, I don't know, smart goals.
Well, and I was going to say, with any project that involves multiple partners, multiple people, sort of giving a sense that you can manage those. I mean, so we have seen, and that's where you kind of prove that it can be in the work plan, where, we sometimes, for, say, I don't know, a big discussion series where they want to do, they say they'll do 75 sites across the country, and there'll be discussions, and there'll be public programs. And then you come to the work plan, and they might even have, a good team. And, in some projects, you really want to make sure you have a good team. But then you come to the work plan, and it just says, find, it's not this blatant, but, find a location, or, find sites. And that's where we have the sort of practitioners and scholars. You can have scholars who are quite excited about the intellectual content. It's great. We want people to have conversations around immigration. And then, a programming librarian will look at that and go, no. It's not going to work. Like, it's going to take longer than a month to do what they say. So, I would say, again, I like the idea of sort of working backwards. And sort of, you need to present a picture, as Maria said, of sort of who's going to do what and how. And being realistic, I think, will get you quite far, as opposed to saying, I'm going to write 7,000 words, or, we're going to suddenly have, 50 sites overnight. So
I'm curious, how often do you run into proposals that promise too little?
Oh. That's interesting. Well, because that is very interesting. Because I think there is a sense, especially with some of our like face-to-face programming projects, that they feel like they need to have 75 sites, 75 museums across the country, and that's not necessarily so. We try to encourage smaller projects. I think sometimes it's the nature. I mean, it's sort of hard to determine what's too small. I mean, we funded projects that will only, reach a small number of people. As my former boss used to say, we fund things like Ken Burns' Vietnam, which had probably, I think, what was it, 3.5 million people, viewers saw it. And then we also have funded projects where I oversee a project in which they do kind of literacy discussion programs with at-risk youth. And these groups are maybe 12 kids, and it might be only, a few. So it's tricky. I think you can shape a project. I think there is a sense, of course, there is pressure since we're a national funder and we're using taxpayer dollars that you should reach a lot of people. Of course, we love that. But, again, as my boss used to say, what we like is to do some of both. That way we can say with honesty, we're reaching people in meaningful ways. We're reaching both a lot of people who maybe only watch 45 minutes of that 20-hour documentary, and then we also reach, a few people whose lives will be significantly changed. So
I would say that for the DH ones, the ones that are too little are the ones that haven't done their due diligence and discovered what else has already been done.
Mm-hmm.
Because there'll be somebody who's maybe just starting out who's just discovered HTML or something like that. That's the most extreme version, or just discovered Google Earth, or and it really is a wonderful learning experience for them. But the way that they propose to do it is not going to be according to contemporary standards. It's not going to be sustainable. It won't be interoperable. It won't be rigorous. There's just all these things that you learn through the process of doing. And so we would have expected them to have noticed that many other people have done that thing and determined what would be the best resource to use for that. And then again, as I said before, how you could move the field forward.
And it sounds. Sorry, no.
I just want to add
Mary.
on.
Yes.
I think I thought of an example with the book projects that could come up. I think in a couple instances, it was the person was so far along with the book, we just were just like, you know what, this person's going to get done. So the person's like, oh, I want to polish my conclusion and work on the table of contents. So it's a slight exaggeration, but when you're looking, when they're competing against somebody from a school with a heavy teaching load, and it's hard to award that one.
It sounds as if what you're saying is don't apply before the process of application should be part of the process of researching the work that you want to do, in a sense, or so in terms of what you're saying, be thorough early on. Understand that the time that you're saying that you need to spend on it is part of the research that's going into whatever the project is ultimately, right? And only when you're ready to do it, you actually write the application, right? I
think that's a really good point. And I remember in a sort of parallel discussion of this topic, Sarah Beckwith, Chair of English, saying, write the grant, pick the moment to write the grant, And it could be, when you're writing the 3rd chapter of 7, or it could be when you're writing the 5th chapter of 7. And it kind of goes back to, the point about due diligence, because you have to be at that point where you kind of are still very excited about the project, but you are far enough into it that you're not naive, And this is, and going back to, Joseph's question about too little. In the musicology panel that I was on, a lot of the ones in the middle, they were perfectly worthy projects, but perhaps they weren't intellectually ambitious, or they weren't, and most people agreed on that, and that was just clear. The ones at the top were sort of, so it wasn't, you know, intellectually ambitious. And so the ones at the bottom were really not very well prepared and didn't hold up to a moment's scrutiny, and you might not have even read through the third page of the narrative because the first page was already a problem. So, I mean, you can take that as a heartening reality of this, because if you think, oh, well, there's 100 applications, how am I going to get this grant? But yours might be better than 50 of them right away if you do it right, you know, and it might be better than, you know, if you do it right, you'll be in the top 20. I mean, that's the way I look at it. And so that does mean being intellectually ambitious, but also honest and realistic. And you know, you may not be ready to write. If you're finishing a book, you may be ready to write an NEH grant for sabbatical leave. But if you're in your first year of a job and you're teaching 3 classes and you feel this pressure to do a grant, you know, and it's good to do it, but you might not be ready that year. But you might be ready next year after you've published an article or two. You know, so it's sort of a practical but very real consideration.
So one of the things that I think as humanists we're not necessarily that skilled at is knowing what we put in a budget, right? I mean, sometimes you can sort of say, I know I have to go to this archive and I know I have to go to that archive, and I know that, you know, roughly it's cost this much to rent a place over here or whatever. But I suppose, you know, it'd be helpful to hear what it is that you expect to see in a budget when one comes into you.
I just very fresh in my mind. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the NEH implementation. Not implementation. I'm sorry, the NEH Next Gen planning grants. So, you know, these are small grants. They're $25,000 grants, and they're to help universities and enhance doctoral training. So, you know, you can only do so much for $25,000. But I remember there were 2 particular things that I continually took issue with on the budgets. And one was the bringing in of consultants sometimes to do things. And there were just more than one situation where they were bringing in somebody to talk. And we were all like, it's going to cost how much for one weekend? Or, you know, just, you know, the consultants, you know, there isn't always a set rate. And I think sometimes with faculty who aren't used to working with consultants, they don't know, you know, or they're not getting different bids, or, I mean, just, so I think there's often, like, there's like overspending, like, especially where consultants are concerned, or just poor use of funds in general. You know, I think there were 1 or 2 situations where the faculty PI was asking for some salary replacement, and we were just a little bit, I think they're allowed to do that, but when you're talking about only $25,000, I think we would have preferred to see the money go to a worthy graduate student, and so in a related vein, a lot of these projects were also funding a grad student to oversee the activities, which is wonderful, but maybe this is the reverse problem. It's like trying to stretch your dollars too far. So, okay, here's our 10-hour-a-week graduate student, and they're going to do this, and this. And so I was often the one going, whoa, I feel really sorry for this graduate student. So there's 2 examples of, you know, budget issues coming up.
Well, the first NEH grant I had, it was, I mean, to put it in perspective, it was a very small grant. So it was $15,000, which, you know, and I remember when I called up ORS and, you know, I mean, this is humanities, right? So I was going to a little conference, $15,000. You know, it probably buys like 1 lens in some microscope if you're in, you know. So ORS, they're dealing with, you know, people, they're used to answering the phone to people who are asking for a million or 2. So, but I don't remember who it was, the colleague who helped me, but she was very, very helpful. And she told me a few things over the phone about the budget, and this is going back to 2009, 2010. So, but I do remember for this particular grant line, it was very important to demonstrate that you had some matching funds already. And I was collaborating with a colleague at UNC who had some matching funds from Germany. I think that's what it came. Anyway, so we were good. We already had some money, and we were asking for more money. So, and also there was, the thing she helped me with was the idea that you could put on the budget certain in-kind. So it was a music conference, right? So we had a concert, and I was able to count that as kind of a free event that Duke University was bringing to the table because my colleagues were doing it for no fee. And so make up a number of how much would it cost, and it's a real thing. So that was a new concept to me. It was sort of matching funds and in kind. And I remember sending the draft budget over to her, and there were some things that were completely wrong with it. Things that were in the wrong column, and she was very patient about, and after a while I realized how completely naive and stupid my understanding of it initially, but I came to understand what it was, and also points about how to use the money. So it was good to ask for money for graduate students to participate in the conference, because that's the kind of thing we talk about under the heading of vertical integration, and this was research, and you don't want to ask, if you're only getting $15,000, you don't want to spend $10,000 on wine,
Well, you might.
or publicity. Publicity is expensive, so you've got to think about is it really worth spending $1,000 on radio advertising for this conference? No. You can spend $200 on printing some posters, yes, but so it does come down to that fine level of detail, and we didn't pay ourselves any PI's fee or anything because we were full-time college professors, handsomely rewarded already. So.
Just a couple more things there. I don't know about that. So one thing about the consultants, in addition to worries over having excessive amounts, I think of them sometimes as a red flag because people perceive them as the magic bullet that's going to solve your problem. So instead of being able to do something in-house internally, there's just this magic person that you're going to somehow find and who's going to take care of a critical component. So knowing who specifically the consultant is and what they do and what they're going to do for you would be important if you're going to include them within there. And I just second the in-kind idea, not only because it gives you a sense of the fuller picture, but it also shows the commitment of the institution to the project, and therefore it's greater likelihood of success.
Do people have questions that we haven't addressed? We have 15 minutes left, so I want to just be sure that if there's anything in particular.
I had a question about international partners or collaborators you might have on the grant, since NEH is national and it's about the US of A and benefiting our taxpayers who pay for it, right? If you can give any insights in general about working with foreign institutions or collaborators and how that might fit into a successful proposal.
Again, it will depend on the grant line. I hate to sort of keep falling back on that, but when I first came to the endowment, we had a special grant line for documentary films called Bridging Cultures Through Film. And so that was initially really created to encourage more filmmakers to take non-US and make the kinds of partnerships that you were thinking about. And in fact, we had a requirement in that particular grant line that at least, I think, 2 of the project scholars had to be outside the US. So it was very targeted, which is, to give you a sense of how this can be. Our overall regulations, project directors need to be U.S. citizens. That's sort of our, the regulation that we have to abide by. In our division, public, the main audience has to be the U.S. But that said, we have funded projects where, again, big museum exhibits where there are 2 U.S. venues and then there might be 2 non-U.S. venues. So our funds couldn't be used for the non-U.S. venues, but we certainly, sort of can fund the U.S. expenses. And of course, you could have scholars from a variety of nations. So
That's really helpful. Thank you.
I'm wondering about recommenders, and I'm wondering behind closed doors exactly how much. I mean, I imagine a good amount of weight is given to them, but I'm curious about the ideal degree of distance.
Yeah.
And also exactly how they figure in.
That's a great question.
Actually, that would be, I mean, we don't have recommenders as part of our grant process. I mean, there are letters of commitment, but to a project, you might be much better at this.
A little bit to that. One thing I was really struck by with the year-long fellowships was just, how much more weight a letter from, someone who's esteemed in your field that you don't necessarily would have a personal connection with, right? So and often the letter can explain how I met this person. Well, I know, I reviewed this person's work for this article and I was so impressed, or I was a reader for their book, or I met so-and-so at a conference and then we collaborated together. I think those kinds of professional collaborations where, you're showing a letter showing that you've earned the esteem of somebody in your field the hard way, as opposed to, well, not that this isn't hard, but getting your dissertation director, especially if you're a younger faculty member, we saw those letters, but they just didn't carry as much weight because it's like, well, sure, it's the dissertation director, or it's somebody who went to that person's, who taught that person in their graduate institution. So I would, just from my own experience, I was definitely more impressed when there was a little bit of distance. That's kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I don't remember. I mean, different readers weigh letters differently as well. I read the letters later if I'm interested in the project, and that's true for grad admissions as well, because there is a certain amount of hyperbole about letters. It's the best student I ever had in 50 years, and it's like, okay, whatever.
Who does X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, so the
On a Tuesday often.
Exactly.
the letters. I mean, my criteria with letters is. It comes back to just writing a good application. If the letter is more compelling than the application, then, which can be the case. You get someone really smart who's in that field, and they articulate better than the grant proposer what's interesting about that field. Then you feel, well, this isn't a good right. The letter is a kind of ancillary supplement to the. It's a supplement, it's a supplement to the main grants, but the grant has to be well written. I don't think there are rules about. It wouldn't be a good idea to ask your dissertation director. It tends to be people, but you don't want to ask someone who doesn't know anything about what is really crucial to your work. It doesn't have to be someone right in your subspecialty, because a lot of time there's only a few of you, and I don't know. It is good to get people who are respected and will take it seriously. I mean, if you ask someone just because you think they're a big name, they're probably not going to write. If you don't know them really well, they're probably not going to write you a good letter. It'll be really short and perfunctory, and that won't help you.
I want to follow up on, Phil, what you brought up about being in touch with the Office of Research Support.
Yeah.
Getting in touch with your colleagues on campus earlier in the process rather than later can only help, so that you have time to have those back and forth conversations, and that we can help you figure out what are the, we can sometimes be those intelligent but not expert readers to say, I don't think I get what you're saying, can you try again? Or we had somebody who shared a draft recently that I read it and I'm like, you're applying for the public program and you're writing this for experts in the field. And so let's recast that voice. But you need to give people time to do that. So don't wait until 2 days before the application deadline to reach out to the Office of Research Support, to reach out to your business managers, to reach out to your colleagues, to ask them to read it. Build in time to invite other people in to help your process.
Yeah, I think one thing I forgot to mention was that, what I just described, what we were talking about with the letters, that's more about, I'm working on a monograph. But if you're applying for something like a challenge grant where, you're on behalf of your institution, you want, $100,000 or more to do something big, there's a whole different set of questions you ask about the letters. So the challenge grant I was involved with at UNC Chapel Hill, we had at least a dozen letters. And in this case, it was important to get them from on campus because we're doing an important project on campus and we needed to show that we were going to have collaboration, support, that they were going to help us get the project done. So you do need to think very carefully and critically about, okay, what is going to show the committee that we're going to have the collaboration support necessary. I'm sure there were many letters for Duke's NEH grant as well. Although I also learned the hard way that the more higher up the person you want a letter from, the more likely you're writing that letter for them. And then they sign it. So
that reminds me of the business with the letters. For the conference grant, you had to include CVs not only of the PI and there was there was one PI, but also of all the participants, sort of a shorter, I forget the format, but we were inviting about 20 scholars, 10 from Europe, 10 Americans, and so, again, you have to plan ahead because you're nagging your colleague in Germany, could you send the CV, and then you have to edit it because it's, the German guy who's writing better English than my German, but still terrible English. So, that polishing of that was part of that, and that's a little bit of extra work. 20 potted CVs, half a page each, or something like that. If those are badly edited, forget it.
Maybe we should end with actually just making sure that everyone knows who they should go to for help in working on their proposals. So, Joseph, do you want to talk a little bit about the work that you do? Laura, you've already mentioned some stuff, but maybe we can just, if people could identify themselves as...
Sure. I work with faculty on interdisciplinary style humanities proposals, on proposals that may involve the FHI, but I'm also available for humanities faculty more generally. We're going to pass this microphone around because there's a lot of support here in this room, and one of the things you need to know is that we all work together as a team. So you ask one of us, and if I think, Laura's really the better person, I'll get you to Laura, and that kind of thing. Speaking of which,
so any grant that goes out from a Duke faculty member needs to be in the Duke official systems, and I am a good point of interface with the sponsored project system and with the Office of Research Support, and making sure that we are staying as part of the Duke systems and having Duke appropriately review budgets and making sure we're not committing things that the institution will not support. And so I'm here much for process. I'm also happy to be a reader and have opinions. I'm full of them. And so we also, when I called Joseph the other week and I was like, I got this thing and I don't think it seems quite on target. Would you look at it? So we do this kind of back and forth and making sure that we're all looking out for each other. And for me, it's regardless of who the sponsor is, whether it's the NEH, the NEA, a public, any kind of sponsor, I'm here to help. Alicia?
Hi, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been shouting out the Office of Research Support. We really appreciate it. I'm Alicia. I'm the Funding Opportunity Specialist. So my main role is helping you find things to apply for, not just NEH, but other fellowships, other grants, foundations, private sponsors, whatever. But there are a lot of people in my office who can help you work with these budgets, like Laura and Philip have been saying. So again, if I'm not the person who can help you with something, I can put you in touch with the correct assistant director who can work with you on processing the paperwork and making sure your grant is submitted and all your T's are crossed and I's are dotted and everything is correct and ready to go out the door.
I'll just add that Alicia's also the person you want emails from her every Monday.
Yes, please sign up for the Funding Alert newsletter, researchfunding.duke.edu. You can subscribe right there, or I'll talk to you after. Who else needs this? Carmel, you want to chat?
So I also work with faculty in the humanities and social sciences and natural sciences and in Pratt. So I serve a lot of people. But so I've supported projects like Maurizio Forte's. Are you with Maurizio? Yeah, I thought so. So I've worked a lot on, I think I've done all of his grants so far that he's done recently. We would really like NEH funding for one of them. I'm just going to say it out loud. But
get right on.
Thank you. And I've also, Joseph and I work together sometimes, or we trade off on who's the better person to support a grant just based on the expertise of the PI. So because I do a lot of support for the sciences, if there's a a humanities grant that has, like the Next Gen grant, because I worked on that one, and there are others that just make more sense for me to be the supporting person based on contacts and things like that. I used to work at RTI, so a lot of the grants that involve RTI are ones that I end up working on just because I know the institution so well. And I've also worked with the Islamic Studies group as well on their stuff, although I pawned the last one off on Joseph because I was on vacation, I think. But anyway, so good luck. Thank you for doing that because you actually got a win. So thank you. All right. Passing it on.
Sure. Again, Ron Fleischman from the Stanford School of Public Policy. I support any project in which there is a Stanford faculty, staff, or PhD student on the grant. So if as long as there is representation of one of those individuals on the grant, you can receive services from my position. So.
Well, and I will just say also some of the divisions will also review grants ahead of the deadline.
Right.
So in public programs, I think our deadline is 4 weeks before a grant deadline. We'll happily review your grant. We'll provide feedback because, again, it's an independent peer review process. Mm-hmm. So we'll provide feedback based on our own academic expertise, but also just sort of what we've seen from reviewers.
And is that true across the board?
It's not. It depends. For example, research, they are unable to do that. But I believe some of the ODH projects as well, and some of the other, maybe preservation and access also. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. I think it's been incredibly informative and helpful, and thank you. Thanks.